Sadly, the president of the Society can't be here this evening, but in many ways, as he is a student of Chinese and I'm a geologist, and geology happens everywhere, so it's probably much more appropriate that I should introduce our speaker this evening than he should. This evening's lecture is the first of 5 in a series organised by the Centre for the Advanced Study of the Arab World in Edinburgh University and hosted by the Society. The other lectures will take place in December, January, February and March. The purpose of the lectures is to provide the public with a greater perspective and insight into the Arab world, focusing on different aspects of its history, its culture, its religion and its politics. Scotland and Edinburgh have a long history of links with the Arab and the Islamic world. For example, I believe that Edinburgh University has been teaching Arabic for 200 years, which is longer than any other institution in Britain, and that's a reflection of the links that it's had. Our speaker this evening is General Simon Mail, Assistant Chief of the General Staff at the Ministry of Defence. He's a cavalryman, did actually look for his horse outside, but sad to say he came in something much more modern. He was commissioned into the Hussars in 1979 after taking a degree in modern history at Balliol College in Oxford. After having been commissioned, he served in Germany, in Cyprus, in Britain, in Oman, and Belgium. He was operations officer for the UK Armoured Division in the First Gulf War and has completed a book on Turkish security policy during that period whilst taking up a defence fellowship at St Antony's College in Oxford. He was appointed Assistant Chief of the General Staff in January 2007. He has a keen interest in politics and history and the theatre. He's considerable experience of the Middle East, and my notes tell me that he speaks very passable Arabic. He's written he's written several articles on crusading history, on Turkey, and jihad philosophy, but all that pales into insignificance beside the fact that he is a long-suffering Tottenham Hotspur supporter. So let me now invite General Mail to give his lecture on jihad and the surge in Iraq. General Mail.
Well, thank you very much, Jeffrey, and good evening to you all. The job I was doing, hence which gives me a slight, whatever, competence to speak about Iraq, as I was the Deputy Corps Commander in Baghdad from late 2006 until early 2007. And I'll come back to that in terms of that was, to an extent, a bit of the tipping point in our assessment of how the Iraq episode, experiment, invasion, prospect, etc., might turn out. I thought just before I kicked off on matters Middle Eastern, I've just mentioned, since I see a lot of people wearing poppies, that at one stage the Royal British Legion wanted to go to Finland at the anniversary of the Winter War of 39-40 between the Finns and the Russians, and they wanted to place a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier. Now, the Finns are very brave soldiers, and they've got lots of memorials, but they were slightly confused about this sort of rather British concept. So when the team from the Royal British Legion turned up with their great wreath, they were led up to a rather big memorial on the outskirts of Helsinki. And they went forward in due style with the wreath, and they stood there, and they placed the wreath, and they stood up and bowed and stepped back. You could just see a quizzical look on their face. And as they addressed their Finnish host, they said, that very moving service, they said, I couldn't help noticing on the memorial the name Sibelius. And the chap said, yes. And he said, well, wasn't he a great composer? And they said, yeah, he was a really great composer, but as a soldier, completely unknown. As I say, if I'd been giving this talk between 2003 and 2006, I think we'd have had a very different atmosphere and background to what was going on. I'll come back in slightly more detail to the 2003 and why the situation after the coalition invasion went so badly wrong. I want to look in this to an extent with a little bit of historical background, which is why I talk about jihad, because I think the historical ideological origins of that, both in its very obvious nature, which is a sort of analogy with the European concept of crusade, but with its other meaning of the greater jihad, the struggle within yourself, it is important for understanding, in among the chaos of 2003-4, the philosophy under which the jihadists sort of characterized by Osama bin Laden to excel al-Zarqawi and al-Masri, sought to gain advantage from that. And then I want to close in on Iraq, again, just to show you how the confluence of anarchy straight after the invasion, insurgency that grew very quickly, incipient civil war between Sunni Shias, potentially Kurds, Arabs, etc., and a totalitarian ideology, largely imported through the lines along the Euphrates and Tigris Valley, really did threaten to overwhelm the coalition in its attempt to its great experiment, and certainly the Iraqi people and the level of violence and the casualties, particularly among the civilian community there. And I look at that Al-Qaeda for shorthand strategy, and then the strategy characterized by the surge, which is a hallmark, and I want to explain a bit more the surge. It's slightly used as shorthand, and people use it rather loosely, simply to refer to more American troops coming into Iraq. It was a considerably more sophisticated strategy that the Americans adopted in 2007 till now, largely driven by Dave Petraeus. Useful, I used to say to people who'd come from America in many cases, and again, for those of you who have American friends, you've got to realize this is quite an alien part of the world among the sophisticated Beltway bandits. They know it well. But for many soldiers coming out of the Midwest or San Francisco or Wisconsin or wherever, this is a difficult area to understand. And I used to say, if you really need to understand a problem, you better get a bigger map. And it is important to spot this. And I'll come back again to a little when I talk about jihad philosophy and how it is driven and takes its quite a lot of its impetus from clearly the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and the division of the former Ottoman Empire into what are fundamentally Western-driven named states, frontiers, and the like. And so there you have Iraq, largely drawn up by the good Gertrude Bell et al. Clearly, the interesting thing about Iraq here is it straddles a number of fault lines. Within it, clearly it has a Kurdish Arab fault line. It's clearly got a Sunni Shia fault line. It sits on the Arab-Persian fault line. To an extent, as a Ba'athist regime, it sat on what one might characterize as a sort of Wahhabist, Salafist, secular Ba'athist fault line as well. It's a real hodgepodge, Iraq, as you know, carved out of three of the former provinces of the Ottoman Empire. And of course, it trails all the way back through here, through Syria, where many of the foreign fighters supporting jihadists came down these two river lines, Tigris, where a lot of the Sunni recidivist movement was taking place, Sunni Triangle. Clearly here you've got a very difficult border to control down to the Shatt al-Arab marshes, this wood hill line, where of course a lot of support was coming from Tehran to Muqtada al-Sadr and the Shias. A lot of financial support, Saudi Arabia running with the fox, hunting with the hounds as usual. And then a lot stretching off into the Maghreb and down into the Horn of Africa of people inspired by the jihadist ideologies of al-Zarqawi, working their way up, come and fight within here in a very messy conflict between ethnic groups, religious groups, Western ideology, modernist ideology, etc. This again, just to show in a little more detail, this is largely the Kurdish area here, and the fault line is clearly just north of Kirkuk, Sulaymaniyah, a hell of a lot of oil potential in Kirkuk. In fact, the British held on to this for a very long time. It was one of the big areas around Mosul, Kirkuk, when the British ran Iraq in the 1920s. It was a cause of enormous friction with the nascent Turkish Republic. Shia, largely down here, not that old historically, and of course during the Saddam times, many connections across to Iran, and a generation of Shia Iraqi politicians who remember the help and succor and refuge they were given during the Saddamist regime. And then this very strong Sunni area, Tikrit, Saddam's birthplace, out here through Anbar, the tribes in Anbar. Come back to those, of course, they were absolutely critical to the change strategy in 2007. And of course, out here, almost absolutely nothing, the Saudi border, etc., down into Jordan. a few of the key parts of Iraq. I'm going to talk about it to an extent from my perspective in Baghdad as the deputy to the Americans, but actually the interface not just with the coalition, or with the coalition and the Iraqi army as we were capacity building. So I'm not going to dwell really on the British experience in Basra. I'm more than happy to take that up in questions. It was a specific set of issues down in the south. No al-Qaeda influence here, almost no Sunnis, fundamentally a power play within Shia groups, Arab Shia groups, and Iranian-supported Shia groups. But I will come back to that because the change of strategy is what has actually pushed to the right the Iranian influence in Iraq. And a lot of that is to do with, do you define yourselves as Shia first or an Arab first? This area here, Baghdad, obviously, Fallujah Ramadi, they're almost again a byword for violence and jihadism and Sunni resistance, etc., to the coalition. A real punching match in the areas of Fallujah Ramadi, Haditha, out to Husayba, and as I say, the foreign fighter lines coming down through the Euphrates. And then if you take it north, this area, which doesn't actually get a great deal of publicity is the wrong word, probably recognition, very, very high up in the list of priorities for the Shia government. It's called Diyala, around the areas of Bakuba, Balad Ruz. A really tough fight goes on there. Most of the media interest in Iraq was centered around Baghdad, the Sunni triangle, which is fundamentally around the areas of Tikrit, Samarra, and Ramadi Fallujah. But this was a very tough fight, not yet finished. Up here will still be an issue, Kirkuk, and then you come across to Mosul. That, interestingly, is really what one might call at the moment the last stronghold of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Still being largely because of the difficulty of controlling this very open border with the Syrians, still where foreign fighters are coming through. This one, to an extent, largely closed off, but this area is where they've consolidated. In terms of jihad, and I've just to say that I suspect in this audience there will be people who are far more a quick laydown on this because the boundaries remain the same at the moment. But we had about 37 nations in the coalition. British down here in Basra, this four large provinces, not much out here, frankly, but this absolutely critical to the future development of Iraq. Oil fields here, very rarely challenged. Actually, the oil continued to flow from the first day of the invasion. Out via some very, very rickety offshore terminals there. They don't refine anything in Iraq, nor do they in Iran. It's unbelievable. They export vast amounts of oil but have to import petrol.